at the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Our lecture this evening has been scheduled so that it will contribute to Black History Month in the UK. In previous years, we have contributed to Black History Month, but this year, at this moment, it is important, I think, to underline the Institute's continuing commitment to addressing anti-Semitism with a wide lens, one that encompasses racism, racial violence, and discrimination wherever it is found. And BISA's commitment too to place the history of Jews as a racialized minority alongside and in conjunction with the history of other racialized minorities. Hence our support for Black history, not least in its connections with the history of Jewish people. And this is just one of the reasons why I am so hugely pleased to introduce our speaker this evening, Laura Arnold-Leibman. Laura is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of English and Humanities at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and the author of The Art of the Jewish Family, A History of Women in Early New York in 5 Objects, published in 2020, which won 3 National Jewish Book Awards. Her next publication, Once We Were Slaves, published by Oxford in 2021, on which this talk is based, was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Awards. Laura will speak for about half an hour, after which there'll be a roughly equal amount of time for questions and discussion. If you have a question or a point that you'd like to make, then please raise your virtual hand, although you're also welcome, if you don't want to speak out loud, to put comments in the chat. So without any further ado, I'll make way for Laura to tell us about a Jewish multiracial family in the early Atlantic world. Laura.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share a screen because I'm somebody who works a lot with visuals, so I have images to share with you. The story that I'm going to tell you about today is the true history of a pair of siblings who began their lives at the end of the 18th century, poor, Christian, and enslaved on the island of Barbados. And by the end of their lives, were some of the wealthiest Jews in New York. And over the course of their lives, their racial identities kept being reassigned. And what I'd like you to take away from today's presentation are 3 primary things. First, I'm hoping you'll remember just something about these 2 people, Sarah Brandon Moses and Isaac Lopez Brandon, because I think they're a really great example of how sometimes the people who've typically been left out of histories turn out to be completely fascinating and to have lived really important lives. The second thing that I hope you'll take away from tonight's presentation is really something to do with the way that Jews and race interacted during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And more specifically, to be really thinking about the ways in which their lives help give us insight into what it was like to be racialized during this time period. So often people have talked about Jews, people who are racially ambiguous during this time period under the guise of what's called passing, that they would somehow leave their identities behind when they traveled to a new place, and then they would have a new race assigned to them. And I want to emphasize tonight that that was absolutely not the case for Sarah and Isaac, in part because of their Judaism. Every single place that they went, people understood and knew that they had been born enslaved and been originally identified as people of color on the island of Barbados. But in spite of that their identity shifted. And so I really want to help people get at what's going on with that kind of ways in which race was very geographically dependent during this time period, particularly for people who were racially ambiguous, such as Sarah and Isaac. The third thing that I'm hoping that you'll take away from this is something more about the larger history about Jews of color and multiracial Jews. So particularly in the United States, we often talk about this history as if it were something that happened very recent, that starting in the 1970s and moving onwards. But really, I want to, through the story of Sarah and Isaac, draw out how, despite the fact that they're unusual because of the racial ambiguity or because of their extreme wealth, they really were part of these larger communities of people of multiracial backgrounds that had one foot in the Jewish community and one foot in other communities, particularly enslaved communities and African-American communities throughout the Atlantic world. So through the presentation, I'm hoping you'll get ideas about those three things, but I'm absolutely open to other questions by the end. So definitely either raise your hand when we're done or put ideas in the comments if you have questions. So as I mentioned, the story of this pair of siblings begins in the eastern part of the Caribbean on the island of Barbados. And Sarah and Isaac were born to a gentleman named Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, who is their father, who was one of the wealthiest Jews on the island by the time that he died. But their mother was somebody named, she had a variety of different names that she went by. Sometimes she was Sarah Esther Gill, sometimes Sarah Esther Lopez, sometimes just Sarah Lopez. Fortunately, her father identified all these different names in his will. So it's like one of those gold mines for historians when somebody actually clarifies things. So she had really a very opposite experience from Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. She was not enslaved to him. She was enslaved to another family, the Lopez family, who were Sephardic Jews on the island. And while Abraham Rodriguez Brandon owned several large labor camps or plantations on the western side of the island, Sarah and Isaac, like their mother, Sarah Esther, were actually born in the main port town of Bridgeton, along a street called Swan Street. And you'll see, if you have a big enough screen, it says very lightly underneath, or Jew Street. And that's because that particular street was the home for many Jews on the island, because it was a primary place where there were shops and other sorts of stores. Both Sarah and Isaac's father and the family that enslaved them were members of the island's main congregation, the Nida Israel Synagogue, which you can still visit today, and some of you may have been there. And like their father was not only a member, he was actually at times the Parnas, or a president of this particular congregation. So he's really a central figure in the island's Jewish community. And I had mentioned that Abraham was particularly wealthy. The family that enslaved them, however, was not. The Lopez family was really more kind of middling family that lived along Swan Street, that owned not one, but actually two different ones of these small shops that we see in this kind of late 19th century photograph of the street. And they would have lived in one of these small apartments above the particular shop. One of their sons of the family was a gold or silversmith, not a particularly famous one, but he made small sort of trinkets. And the other one had a small every good shop, the records of which miraculously survive to this day in New York. One thing that very quickly set Sarah's life apart from that of many of the other enslaved people on the island was that there was a moment around 1800, so she's born in 1798, when suddenly the Anglican Church becomes more open about baptizing enslaved people. And because of this, Sarah's mother takes her to the nearby church, now St. Michael's Cathedral, and has her daughter baptized. And this is really important because that baptism allows Sarah to have some sort of protection against white men that her mother didn't have, nor her grandmother or her great-grandmother. So really, her mother is trying to provide her some sort of protection that she would someday be able to be legally married in the church and be seen as somebody who had a virtue that needed being protected in ways that many enslaved women did not have. Her mother did not take her to the local synagogues, Nida Israel Synagogue, because the mother was not halakhically Jewish. She was not Jewish according to Jewish law. So that meant that she could not have her children registered at the synagogue. So really the cathedral is, or church is, the only place that's open to her for having a sort of religious registration. But at the same time, that registration comes at a pretty extreme cost, which is as soon as she's registered and baptized, her race is also assigned to her. So Sarah's race is assigned as being a mixed-raced woman. And had she stayed on the island for her entire life, that race would have followed her throughout her life and would never have been able to be changed. It's something that is similar to what in the US later would be considered like the one drop rule. If you have any African ancestors at all on the island during this time period, you are considered a person of color. And the baptismal font where she was baptized is still in that cathedral today. So Sarah and her brother Isaac, who was born too early to be part of that sort of more lenient vision of baptism, grow up living in and around Swan Street. And their lives might have been very much similar to almost anybody who was an urban slave in Bridgetown during this time period, if it weren't for two really unusual things that happened in 1801. The first of those is that their mother's father, who's a white Anglican man, dies. And strangely, he decides to leave his houses and his money not to his white relatives, to his nieces and nephews, but instead to the children and women that he had relationships with. So he has relationships with a couple different women of color, he has children by them, and he leaves his various houses to those particular families. And again, very, very unusual during this time period. And I think it's really important to call attention to how there are aspects of Sarah and Isaac's lives that are unusual so that we get a sense of why this isn't the typical story that people experienced who were enslaved in Barbados. So when Sarah is only 3 years old and her brother is 9, their mother inherits part of a house along Back Church Street. And for me, the location of this house is important. I mean, it's important just that it's a house because suddenly their mother goes from somebody considered a piece of property to owning property herself. But also it's located right near where St. Mary's Church will be built very shortly thereafter. And St. Mary's Church becomes a really important locus for elite free people of color for their social activities. So something the grandfather wouldn't have known, but it becomes a very strategic place for the family to have real estate. However, it's also located very near where soon will be built the island's Methodist Church. And this is where the methods for writing my history become very, very important. Early on, I had decided that I wanted to not only trace the Jewish side of their family, but also their enslaved ancestors. And this ended up paying off more than I could have ever imagined. So I was able to trace back their enslaved family several generations. And it turns out that they are related to the first female national hero of Barbados, a woman who now is commonly called Sarah Ann Gill, but at the time was known as Ann Jordan. And she is married to one of their mother's brothers. And she is very famous on the island even today because, witness that there's a stamp for her, because she uses religion in order to gain civil and religious rights for both free and enslaved people of color. And for me, this is super important to know, not only because their family is an important family on the island in terms of their mother's family, but also because that history of agitating for civil rights will become something that Isaac Lopez Brandon inherits from his mother's side of the family. And now it's angry at me that I went over and moved something. So just to kind of quickly tell you where we're at, because I've thrown out a lot of different names. Here is their father, Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. Here is their mother, Sarah Esther Gill, Isaac Lopez, Sarah Rodriguez Brandon. And they also had two other sisters who died presumably when they were very young. They're on early records and then they disappear from the history. Sarah had 3 different brothers, one of whom married that very famous revolutionary activist on the island, Anne Jordan. And here over, see if I can make this much smaller. Here is their grandfather, George Gill, who was a white Anglican, one of his families, other families on the island. This woman, along with Anne Jordan, was a very important activist on the island. And I was able to trace not only Sarah Esther Gill's mother, Jemima Lopez, but actually one generation further back, Deborah Lopez, Deborah, Jemima, Sarah, all of her brothers, and all of these children were all enslaved to that Lopez family. So really important to understand how the generations were moving forward in terms of being enslaved to this Lopez family, and how the Lopez family is really building their wealth off of this particular family through having acquired Deborah, the great-grandmother of Sarah and Isaac, many years earlier. So that was the first major thing that happens in 1801 that radically changes their lives. The family inherits property and they start to make this movement towards freedom. And that same year, their father also helps make sure that his children will be free going forward. And he does that by taking both of his children back to St. Michael's Church, not to have them baptized, but to pay for them to be manumitted from the Lopez family, that is freed from the Lopez family, and to solidify their freedom going forward. And he does that not only by paying the family, but by paying the church. In case the family falls on hard times, the church would take care of them. This is just sort of standard practice on the island at the time. So again, so unusual on the island. Most people on the island who are born enslaved at the time that Sarah and Isaac are born enslaved will have to wait until general emancipation in 1834 to 1838. There's this 4-year apprenticeship period in order to become free. And so this is just a wildly different life story than they would have had they not been taken to that particular church to be freed from the Lopez family. Important to understand that Isaac, had he not been freed at this moment, instead of being freed from the time he was 9 years on, he would have spent his entire early adult life until he's in his 40s being enslaved. And Sarah would have not only spent her entire life, because she dies before complete emancipation happens on the island, she also, all of her children would have been born enslaved as well. So really just a radically different opportunity for the family, and something that sets them apart from other people who are born enslaved on the island. So again, Sarah and Isaac have this opportunity through the inherited property, through their freedom, and they might have then been like many of the other families who lived in and around Swan Street, who had one foot in the synagogue, but one foot outside of it in the community of free people of color, like their aunt Anne Jordan was part of. But they always would have been in the margins of the synagogue, because the Nida Israel Synagogue did not allow people generally to be converted during this time period. And at some point during his teenage years, Isaac decides enough is enough. He has a religious experience and he doesn't become a Methodist like his aunt. Instead, he decides that he wants to become a full-fledged member of the Jewish community. And so in order to make that happen, Isaac and his younger sister, who's only about 11 or 12, decide to, whoops, we're kind of out of sync there, decide to travel south from Barbados to the colony of Suriname. And this is a moment where it's probably worth saying, like, why Suriname? Because most of us today might not travel to Suriname to convert to Judaism. So during this time period, Suriname, along with this little peanut-shaped island off the coast of Venezuela, Curacao, have the 2 largest Jewish communities in the Atlantic world. And of those 2, however, Suriname has the largest community of multiracial Jews. So by the time that Sarah and Isaac arrive in Suriname, at least half of the Jewish community has at least one African ancestor, though according to the island's racial laws, only about 10% of the community are considered people of color. And I'll get at that difference between the 50% and 10% in just a moment. So they don't go to Curacao, the little peanut-shaped island. They instead go to the colony of Suriname, which has this longer history of inclusion of people of color into the Jewish community. And that inclusion has been going on for over 100 years by the time that they arrive. So generations of people with both Jewish and African ancestry are members of the Surinamese community. When they arrive, they settle in the main port town of Paramaribo. And unlike in Bridgetown, where there's really only one synagogue available, here they actually have a choice of where to convert. At the time that they arrive, there are two congregations. Slightly before, there's sort of three. And they decide to go to the Portuguese congregation in order to convert. And this kind of makes sense because their father is a Portuguese Jew, but I think it's also worth noting that during this time period in the Atlantic world, in London and Amsterdam, as well as in the colonies, it was considered higher status to be a Portuguese Jew than to be an Ashkenazi Jew. So if you had a choice, it would make sense that you would want to convert to being a Portuguese Jew. But fortunately, they also have this genetic tie to it. Today, the interior of this particular congregation is in a museum in Israel. So some of you may have seen the interior, but at the time, it was part of that synagogue that was in Paramaribo itself. And following being given permission and for Isaac to be circumcised and presumably healing a little bit, the two of them go through a formal conversion process, go to the little building behind the synagogue, which more recently was used as a Kiddush place for holding food services after the congregation finished meeting. And there's a trap door that could be lifted up. And now today it's dry, but it would have been filled with water. They would go down the stairs, immerse in the ritual bath, and then come back up, halakhically Jewish. That is legally Jewish. And sometimes I'll get questions about, like, is a conversion from Suriname considered a good conversion during this time period? I think it's really important to know, yes. So remember, Suriname and Curacao are really big communities. They have really big infrastructure. These are considered, there's a Beit Din that they would have gone to. There are plenty of rabbis in this colony. There's, during this time period, about 9 different circumcisers that live in Suriname. So really quite a thriving community. But also worth noting that had they been converted in some place like Philadelphia or New York, they would have run into problems when they went to London, because Philadelphia and New York are not considered great conversions. Suriname, yes. So definitely something that like sets them up for the rest of their lives. I mentioned that there were other choices. There was around the corner from them an Ashkenazi congregation that or a High German congregation. This congregation, although the building looks beautiful and is beautiful, if you were somebody from the Sephardic congregation and you married somebody in this congregation, you would actually be demoted to kind of a second-class member of the Sephardic congregation. So worth noting that the congregations didn't see themselves as having equal standing. However, both somebody, either if you were from the Ashkenazi congregation or from the Sephardic one, if you were somebody who was considered a person of color, you also had a second-class status in both of these congregations. And I think this can help us understand why Sarah and Isaac don't end up staying in Suriname for the rest of their lives. So remember, I had mentioned there was that difference between that 50% of the people who have an African ancestor, but maybe only 10% are considered to be people of color. That's because in Suriname, unlike in Barbados, the way that race was understood was if 7 out of your 8 great-grandparents were Europeans, then, or of European ancestry, then you could either be white or be considered a person of color. So if your parents were legally married, you were white. If your parents weren't legally married, they were a person of color. If they married after you were born, your race got changed from being a person of color to being white. So we have this whitening that goes on of people who could have been people of color, but either through time or through this process of marriage became part of the white community. And in response to this, we see the Suriname community doing something which is completely contrary to Jewish law, which is they adapt their marriage contracts to deal with this legal definitions of race that are going on in the colony. And they start including in marriage contracts for people who are considered people of color, information about the racial status. And again, this is something I don't think we find anywhere else, and it's completely contrary to Jewish law. But this is a marriage contract, for example, of two people who were considered Jews of color in the community. And they had marked in the marriage contract, not that they were a different race. So sometimes in early Jewish materials from the colonies, you'll see people being racialized as being Cushites or Ethiopians or some other race. So they're not racialized that way, but there is this phrase in there that they are emancipated Jews. So there's this illusion that they or their family were once enslaved. And that then causes them to have a secondary status, or if somebody marries them, that person, even if they were a European Jew, would be demoted to this second class status. And that means they would have been buried in the bad part of the cemetery. They would have sat in the second class seats in the synagogue. They couldn't be called up to the Torah for honors, and they couldn't vote in any synagogue elections in order to change those things. So really important, I think, for understanding why somebody like Sarah and Isaac, whose parents never legally married, and who hence we know from the records from this colony were racialized as people of color, would have also been stigmatized going forward, regardless of who they married in this colony. So I mentioned that there was also a kind of third community. Really important to know that the Jews of color in Suriname, that 10%, did not take this sort of racism against them lightly. They formed their own community called Dar HaYesharim, which was called a brotherhood most of the time that it was in around. And they at some point petitioned to have that brotherhood made into a formal synagogue so that they could vote on things. They could have Torah honors. They could be treated as full members of a Jewish community. But when they did that, both the High German and the Portuguese communities petitioned to the government to have Dar HaYesharim disbanded. And despite the protests of the Dar HaYesharim, of the Jews of color in the colony, Dar HaYesharim was disbanded and hence was not available as a place where Sarah and Isaac could convert when they arrived. However, different members of that community were still very present and had this history, again, of agitating for civil rights that for me becomes very important as the siblings decide to leave the colony after their conversion. Isaac goes back to Barbados and becomes very heavily involved in the civil rights movement on the island. This does not end up turning out very well for him. I'm not going to talk a lot about it right now, but feel free to ask me more about it in the question and answer period. Instead, we're going to follow Sarah, his younger sister, who instead of going back to the island of Barbados, goes to some place that will be closer to home for you, which is she, with her father's help, decides to go to London. Now, as I'm sure you know, part of the draw of going to London was Bevis Marks, the Portuguese congregation, which in many ways was the mothership for many of those different congregations like Nida Israel that are throughout the Atlantic world. So this really is a place where many Barbadian Jews come back to, particularly if they have Portuguese roots, whenever they're in London doing business. And we know that her father has various relationships with people in that congregation, along with other families from Barbados. But Sarah doesn't stay in London proper at the time, but instead travels south to where she is, through the help of her father, able to attend an elite Sephardic boarding school where she learns things that are almost as important, I think, as her conversion for her becoming a really thriving member of this elite Sephardic community. She's rubbing shoulders with people like the Montefiore's, establishing relationships, but she's also learning how to speak the languages important for Portuguese Jews. She's learning some Hebrew, some Spanish, some Portuguese, a little bit of French because fancy people did. She's learning how to run a household with servants as opposed to being a servant. And she's learning how to be part of that elite Sephardic world. And it's while she's at that boarding school or slightly afterwards that her father has one of the miniature makers in London make this beautiful portrait of her. These are very small little portraits and were often exchanged between people as part of the marriage process for brokering different alliances. Really important that it's also a way in which Jews during this time period used a genre which was associated with sort of a glowing whiteness through the ivory. This is a close-up of the brother. You can see how the ivory is not even painted, it's just sort of glowing through in order to emphasize their alliance with this white elite. So really important that these are not necessarily miniatures which tell us the truth of the person. They are visions of how the portrait maker thinks they should be presented. So important to compare what Sarah's looks like to those of other multiracial women here in Suriname and in Haiti, early New York, where the portrait makers often make them look scratchy, exactly what they're not supposed to be doing according to portrait making miniature manuals. And that is the racial bias of the portrait maker coming through, something which we absolutely do not see in Sarah's portrait, perhaps because of the intervention of her father. Her miniature goes back to Bevis Marks, and it meets another miniature of a Jew who's visiting on business from New York, that of Joshua Moses. Like Sarah, he is part of one of these big merchant families, I think in really important ways. This is almost a marriage between the two fathers-in-law as much as between the two, between Joshua and Sarah. So Isaac is the wealthiest Jew in New York. Her father is the wealthiest Jew in Barbados. Sarah's given a 10,000 pound dowry, about 30 million US dollars worth of purchasing money in today's money. She's a phenomenal heiress. Also important that for this time, she really got the higher status in terms of Bevis Marks. Unlike in Suriname, her racial history is not added into the ketubah. Instead, what's emphasized is that she's a Portuguese Jew. And in Bevis Marks during this time period, he is a lowly Ashkenazi Jew, somebody who only recently would have been allowed to marry Sarah in the congregation. So she really has the higher status in London. Again, we're seeing that importance of that movement. After their marriage, they settle briefly in London before moving back to New York, where they settle on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, near the sort of one of those breakaways of people from Bevis Marks in Shearith, Israel. Very soon after they settle here is Sarah and Joshua's house. Isaac ends up coming north from Barbados. He's been kicked out of the Barbadian congregation because of racism that was pushed on them by the Anglicans during a civil rights dispute. Through the help of this new family, he ends up becoming not only married to one of the other members of the Moses family, but a voting member of the Shearith Israel congregation and a voting member of the United States. So again, we're seeing, had he gone to New Orleans, he would have been considered a person of color, but race really varies by state to state in the US during this time period. And in New York, both in the eyes of the Jewish community and in the eyes of his family, he's being reshaped as being somebody who by the eyes of the census and the government are considered white. So his Jewishness trumps the other issues, in spite of the fact that his brother-in-law Joshua had gone to Talmud Torah with the grandson of their enslaver, in spite of the fact that people know that he was born enslaved and that some members of the congregation are very openly racist. So a very interesting moment where through those travels, his race changes. When he goes back to Barbados on business, he's still a person of color in Barbados. He comes back to New York, he's white. Both Sarah and Isaac thrive in this community. Sarah dies before the age of 30, but not before she has 10 children, 9 of whom survive to adulthood. They become really important members of this congregation. One of her sons is the president of the congregation. Several of her sons are Civil War heroes. One of her sons, Lionel, marries the granddaughter of the most important Hazan of Sherith Israel. So really becomes central, and they do not continue to have that sort of racism that they had experienced in other places because of being able to move into New York, because of shifting notions of how race is being understood. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. And I hope that people have some questions for me, but I hope I've given you a taste of both how extraordinary their lives were, as well as that shifting notion of race and how that race functioned very differently during this time period than many of us might have thought.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was completely fascinating. I mean, the way you connect this extraordinary story to, I suppose, broader patterns of social development and at the time. Can I just start by asking you a question, I think, about Sarah and Isaac? That there was a sense, and I don't know if this was completely intended or whether it's my projection, that Isaac comes out as an idealist, that he has a religious experience, he converts to Judaism, he goes back to Barbados to take part in the civil rights movement. Sarah, by contrast, goes to London in pursuit of social mobility. And I wondered if that is how you see it.
Yeah, I think that's a really, I haven't framed it that way before, but I think that's an interesting point. And I think it also gets at how different their experiences were. That you had mentioned that I had written before this a book about women in early New York. And I was sort of used to, from working in women's history, of thinking about women as having a harder time than men. And this is where I think that kind of what I would call an intersectional approach of thinking about race in combination with gender is so important, that Isaac really has a very difficult time each place that he goes, struggling to gain the things, the rights that he wants for himself. And that struggle, I think, really has to do with the fact that as a man, there's more at stake, right? Like he has the opportunity to vote in various places, whereas Sarah never would, because women don't have the right to vote during this time period in any of the places she lives. So I think there is a way in which there's both an idealism there, but also a sort of crushing nature of the racism and anti-Semitism that he experiences. So the synagogue in Barbados originally very much accepts him. They talk about, they don't distinguish between him and any other member of the congregation, that he's one of their favorite members of the congregation because he's such a gentleman and because he's a great contributor to the congregation. And then the Anglicans step in and say, like, if you want the right to vote, you have to kick Isaac out. Huge fight ensues, and they end up taking away Isaac's rights. And you can tell from his father's responses, this is brutal, right? Like, so crushing to somebody who has struggled to be embraced, been embraced, and then desolated by the way that he's been treated. So yeah, I think there is that way in which he is somebody who's constantly striving for things, and as a result of that also experiences a huge amount of hardship.
Thank you. While we wait for people to raise their hands or to put a question in the chat. I won't, Phil. I'll ask Bernard Miller if you have a question. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, first of all, can I thank you for a beautifully presented and extremely well documented presentation, which I really enjoyed. I am related to Sarah and Isaac by one marriage and to some of the other people that you've mentioned, and keep discovering relatives, particularly not so much from Barbados, but certainly Suriname and Curacao, who were relatives and who were very clearly mixed race. And some of the governors, one of them, Abraham de Vere, I think was Dutch, mixed race, Sephardic Jewish, had a partner who was Ghanaian and doesn't seem to have had any history of slavery, but the portraits that you see of her show that, in fact, she was probably mixed race as well. So there was a lot of mixing going on. And I wondered, in fact, whether you had looked at the extent to which the mixed race, as opposed to the Jewish and mixed families, took on leadership roles in the community and the government of the islands. And a lot of it seems to go back to Holland, because there seems to have been already a degree of intermixing and acceptance of people who were coming over from Holland. So I hope I haven't made that too complicated, but thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. So definitely email me. I mean, one of the joys of doing this project has been being able to find more descendants. Like I had contact with some of the descendants before it was published, but have found more since then and been able to connect them. So email me and maybe I'll be able to connect you with some other people as well. Yeah, I think you're pointing out about Suriname and Curacao definitely gets it. Like the role of people varies tremendously depending on whether it's a Dutch colony or a British colony, in part because of the history of slavery. So slavery ends much earlier in the British colonies than it does in the Dutch colonies. And that really shapes what opportunities are available for people. So particularly in Barbados, one of the things that I did a whole project for a while about people who were not identifying as Jewish, but had some Jewish ancestry and some African ancestry, and their relationship, for example, in that St. Mary's Church that I was talking about, to other free people of color. And I was really interested in how people who didn't identify as Jewish, who were very Anglican, but had some Jewish ancestry, often married other people that have partial Jewish ancestry. So you see sort of family connections continuing. So that was a trend that I would love to see somebody trace out more about, and to really think about why. And then in addition, they tended to be, the people who had some Jewish ancestry often were very active in those early civil rights petitions that were non-religious, so not in the Methodist Church only, but also in the sort of general petitions on the island for changing the role of people of color in terms of island governance. So again, I feel like there's something more in that story that really could be brought out. And I haven't traced as many of the families in Suriname in terms of their role in politics, but I would be really curious to see if those same trends continue going forward in other places, and what sort of chasing them. So I don't know if other people are obsessed with the V&A, but if you go to the V&A's website, you'll notice there's a number of items donated by the Montefiore family, and they're actually by multiracial members of the Montefiore family who became part of that Anglican elite of free people of color on the island. And they're a really good example of this. Like they're Anglican, but both the wife and the husband of the family, who left a number of different items to the V&A, or their descendants did, both had Jewish ancestry. So really interesting, I think, work that could be done in that area.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. We have a question from François Guenet. François?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. If time permits, would you tell us more about Anne Jordan? Because I thought this was a very interesting context, that you have actually not only the brother moving into the civil rights movement, but also this relative. You mentioned that she operated this through religion, and that's an aspect which I really find interesting, and I would be very grateful if you could expand on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. So I feel like you're playing into the heart of the historian, who always has like some rabbit hole that they go down, that they can only use part of the information in the rabbit hole. So one of the rabbit holes that I went down during this project was really looking into that Methodist church on the island. So Anne Jordan, or Anne Jordan Gill, or now her name got changed after she died to Sarah Ann, which I really find annoying, because everybody seems to be named Sarah on the island. And it's like, the last thing we need is another person being named Sarah, but I put that aside. But she is somebody who really takes advantage of the differences between Methodism and Anglican churches on the island. So like in most British colonies, the Anglican church is the state religion. You have to be a member of the Anglican church in order, or a vestry, in order to be able to vote in island politics. So the legislature on the island is often referred to as a plantocracy, but it's all Anglicans. And the Jews try to become another vestry in order to sort of get around this Anglican stronghold. During the 1820s, the Methodist Church gets set up as a place that really is rethinking how social hierarchies are related to spiritual hierarchies. And unlike the Anglican Church, they allow not only people of color, but also women to be ministers and to preach to different people and to hold services. And they allow people, even their seating arrangement is much less hierarchical than that of the Anglican or the Jewish congregation. So it really is a place where a lot of radical thought is going on the island. And the Anglicans are so angry about it that they go and first they tear apart the entire Methodist church, like stone by stone, piece of wood by piece of wood. And then the next day they come back and they throw the whole thing into the bay. So at that point, the white minister leaves and Anne Jordan takes over, and she eventually gets thrown in prison for using religion in this way of like welcoming in enslaved people, being a woman of color who's allowed to preach. Like, it's just a radical change from what's happened elsewhere on the island. And I think there's a reason why she's like the first female national hero of Barbados. She was the only national female hero of Barbados until Rihanna was recently made the second female national hero. But really, I think is an important gesture towards how minority religions in the British colonies can be this place of agitation. And the Jews also suffer from this perception that they're allowing agitation. It's part of why Isaac is so threatening to the Anglicans and force him to sort of get kicked out. But we do see one of the synagogues got destroyed in a similar kind of Anglican riot because of concerns that the Jews are fostering rebellion. And we do see a lot of movement back and forth between the Methodist Church and the Jewish congregation. The religious leaders are talking with each other. It's in their diaries. Really interesting to my mind that it's not all Anglican paranoia, that there's something going on with these minority religions, that they're changing the way that power structures could be working.
Thank you, Laura. We have a couple of people with their hands up, and I'll come to them in a moment, but we've also accumulated some questions in the chat, which I'll pass on to you, Laura, now as a job lot. A couple of them are quite specific. One is from Sophia Facey. Do your family have links into the Lindo family?
Yeah, so
before you do, let me just give you them together, Laura. Both Jill Prager and Elizabeth Mystery would like to know if we know anything about the boarding school in England to which Sarah went. And lastly, if I'm just scrolling down from Sharon B, deeply fascinating, Laura, is there any history at all beyond the parents of Sarah and Isaac? Do we know anything more about Sarah and Isaac's parents' ancestry and history? How far back can you go?
Yeah. Thank you. So the Lindo question, I would have to sit down and go through them, but I feel like during this time period, there's almost always connections between the Sephardic families. They tend to be very intertwined. I think that there's connections between the Brandon family and the Lindo family in Jamaica during this time period, but the relationship between the Barbadian Brandons and the Jamaican ones is always sort of a trouble point for me. And a number of us have tried to figure out exactly how they're connected, and it's very difficult. So the answer is probably, but something that we've troubled over and haven't been able to trace out completely. I will skip ahead to, there's a number of questions about the boarding schools. There's a couple different Sephardic boarding schools during this time period that pop up. For all of the kind of elite boarding schools, the records are not good. Like, they weren't well preserved. It's one of the things that I find enormously frustrating. There's some early records from the Jewish Historical Society of early articles that will mention things that have then since disappeared. Usually they're just named by the person who is running it. So there's one of them is in Peckham, and Sarah and Isaac actually have a family of half siblings after their mother passes away. Their mother dies in New York during a flu epidemic in the 1820s, and their father goes on to have a second family. And that family actually comes back to, after his death, comes back to London and become really important players in the London community as well. And those siblings, we know, go to one of those Sephardic boarding schools in the 1840s, run by a Sephardic woman. So again, we have very few records left about them. Most of what we know has to do from when their half siblings, half sisters were at this boarding school in the 1840s. It's one of my frustrations that I constantly am going back and like, maybe I'll find something, and it's bleak as far as I can tell. There's partially it's this problem of, we have stuff from the 1840s because there's census records. And of course, earlier, we're sort of more at the mercy of what gets surviving. Yeah, so they're all sort of what would be London now, but it's sort of south of London. One of the boarding schools is very close to where the London Jewish Museum was before it shut down briefly. I'm always like, it's got to come back, the London Jewish Museum, because I love that place. So while it's before it got shut down, one of the boarding schools was right near there. There was another question about the parents of Sarah and Isaac. So I strangely know much more about Sarah and Isaac's mother than about their father. Their father's history is very much debilitated by the records that have survived in Barbados. For anybody who's worked on the islands, there's a history of hurricanes and of fires that come after hurricanes. That means there's always sort of spotty records. And the lineage of their father is much more unknown than the lineage of their mother at this point. That we know he's related to the Rodriguez-Brandon families, and his precise path through that is, again, there's a couple different candidates of who his father might be. So, but he lives on the island until the 1830s, and he dies after one of the big hurricanes. And his second mistress and their children end up coming to London and setting up. Isaac ends up being the person who's identified in the will, not only as the executor of the will, but also as the guardian of that second set of children. And so those families remain very closely tied going forward, and connect in various places that they're living. I don't know if that helps. Interestingly, their mother, there's no sense that she ever converted anywhere. I've never found a record, but she is buried in the Jewish cemetery in New York, in an Orthodox cemetery.
Here, Tia Bannon, you've been waiting very patiently. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. As a Jewish Afro-Caribbean person, it's very interesting to hear these types of stories. I'm actually Bayesian myself. I just had two questions. I'm in a hotel room, so I missed the beginning, and I wondered where Sarah's mother was from. And then the second part of the question was something that you mentioned, that there wasn't this wasn't passing in the ways that they were able to mobilize. But there are some indications for me where it feels a bit like, well, the portrait painted her as this Ivorian being, and she got to travel and leave Barbados and exist in a way that her, although she may have been racialized for being Jewish, isn't something that was sort of oppressing her in other ways. So I just wondered if you could expand on that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the Sarah and Isaac's mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother all are, so I know at least, maybe not their great-grandmother, but okay, so at least their mother and their uncles and their grandmother are all born on the island of Barbados. I'm fairly certain that their great-grandmother is also born on the island of Barbados. They are all enslaved to the Lopez family, which is one of the other Sephardic families in Bridgetown. The DNA records from their descendants suggest that their ancestors who came to Barbados came from the sort of area around Nigeria, perhaps, which is pretty common in terms of people coming to into Barbados during that time period. But it is also interesting in that that's a region that does have a very strong history of people identifying as Jewish as well. And that history also comes into both in Suriname and in Barbados and other communities of people bringing oral history of Jewish ancestors from Africa as well. So I think really important. Yes, thank you, Bantu tribes. So, definitely they're living for generations on the island before Sarah and Isaac are born. In terms of, I'm trying to remember your second question, I think had to do with the miniature. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about the miniatures is this sort of way in which they give us this pretense that we're actually seeing somebody, but I think we all know from photographs today, from social media, that photographs get, changed in terms of how people are represented, that we can take 50 photographs and pick the one that we want, right? So their father, who has both miniatures and oil paintings that survive, appears lighter skinned in the miniature than he does in the oil painting. And I think that really has to do with the genre of the painting. Like, it doesn't have to do with like suddenly he became darker skinned as he became older, but I think does point to the way in which being parts of the Portuguese community perhaps allows them a little bit of that mobility in ways that they might not have had as part of the Ashkenazi community. And that during this time period, at least, both inside and outside of the Portuguese community, that people think of them as being more olive toned in skin. And so it would be much easier to present yourself as somebody who's racially ambiguous as being a Portuguese Jew and not have people constantly questioning it. I think there's ways in which their story does resemble passing, in that one of the things that happens with passing is, people may know this, there's a very recent movie made from one of Nella Larson's books called Passing recently, and I think it really focuses on the sort of horrors of passing in some ways, of like what you're being forced to leave behind and what you're being forced to not show to the rest of the world, and the sort of loss of family and the loss of culture that happens through wanting to have sort of social privileges. And I do think that there's that aspect going on with her time in the boarding school in particular, that presumably she's being trained to behave and to speak a certain way that suggests that she's part of the Sephardic elite and to leave certain parts of her life behind. And that may also be part of why she has an easier time becoming part of that Sephardic world. I think what makes her story very different from stories like Nella Larson tells, where there's like, or you see in a lot of 19th century American literature about passing, is that the people in those stories are always trying to hide their past from the people who are racializing them as white. And what makes Sarah and Isaac's story, and I think particularly a Jewish story for this time period, is that every single place they go, people know that they were born enslaved. There's members of the Barbados community in each of the congregations they belong to. The people who witnessed Sarah's wedding are people from Barbados who knew that she was born enslaved. So again, that deception part is not part of the story that's going on with them. Instead, it has to do more with this like race being understood differently in the different places, so they're being racialized differently. I don't know if that helps at all.
Thank you, that's really useful.
And thank you, Laura. We are unfortunately at the end of our time for this event, but before we close, I would like to thank everyone who has joined us this evening and given up your time. Especially like to thank those who have contributed in the chat and with questions. Before thanking Laura and myself, I'll just mention that our next public event is an in-person event here at Birkbeck, and it will be Nisa Finney from the University of St Andrews, who will be talking about contemporary Jewish identities and experiences of racism. What can we learn from big data? And that's on the 21st of November at 6:30 in the evening. But my most important task now is to thank Laura for a really fascinating, brilliant talk. I mean, the research which you've undertaken for this is meticulous and really must have been so laborious, but you have delivered the story and also its significance with such vivacity and grace, and really have illumined our evening. Thank you very much indeed, Laura.
Thank you so much. And thank you to David and everybody who showed up, as well as to the Birkbeck Institute and all of the fantastic work that you're doing. Such an important job.